Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the continuing drama of the California State Budget Crisis. This is the first hearing of our newly formed Budget Committee, and I'm pleased to be chairing this year and stepping into the unfillable shoes of our beloved Denise Ducheney, but we're going to do the best job that we can. We want to welcome our returning Budget Committee members and also to welcome our newly seated Budget Committee members. On the Republican side, we have Senators Fuller and Emerson. Welcome. And on the Democratic side, we have Senators Rubio and Evans. Also welcome to you. Today we will go over the proposals of Governor Schwarzenegger's ideas to resolve the approximately $6 billion deficit that we have in the current year. And also, I think we will feel free, of course, to discuss the bigger picture as well. I think just about all of us were at the governor's summit yesterday, and I was, in spite of the enormity of the challenge, very encouraged, and I'll share some of my reasons for that in just a moment. There's a story in the LA Times just the other day making some comparisons of some of the other states that are struggling with their budget deficits. In the current year, the state of Illinois has a 47% imbalance compared to our 6-7%. So they're seriously more challenged than we. The state of Nevada in the coming budget year has, I think, the largest hole in the country, over 30%. So whereas we've got our work set out for us, this is a national crisis. It's a national phenomenon, and we shouldn't lose sight of that at all. So some of the reasons I was encouraged yesterday, and I hope that we can, if nothing else today, as we hear some of the proposals, and we know that just about everything short of the late fees, which we'll get into, has all been brought before us before and has been heard by the Budget Committee before, so we won't be going over previously covered territory. But I hope that we can set a tone that we're really all in this together. And whereas Governor Brown said yesterday he wanted to lay out the scope and the depth of the challenge and the crisis, he wasn't interested in addressing solutions. And I think that was a wise first step. I think we shifted from that toward the end of the discussion yesterday. But why I say that we're so in this together this year more than any other year, and this is my 9th budget year now, and so many of those years have been just a repetition of the same banging of heads. Governor Brown made it very clear in his campaign that he would support no new revenue that wasn't approved by voters. So I think we just need to recognize, whether there's a 2/3 desire for there or not, I'm not going to even suggest that there is or will be, but the governor will not support it. So conditionally, if there is going to be any revenue that we don't have currently to address this now $25 to $28 billion hole over the next 18 months, it's only going to be with voter approval. And there were 2 slides among all the many we saw yesterday that stood out for me. The one was in Treasurer Lockyer's. It was on his page 3, and it was the slide which deals with the percent of general fund now spent on debt service and how it has increased over the past 7 years from approximately 2.6% of general fund in 2004 to 5.8% today. The Treasurer said that we're reaching our limits, and Governor Brown was also very clear that borrowing comes with a price, and he's not likely to be supporting much more. So we've hit the wall on borrowing. Just to digress briefly, when I talk to students about balancing a budget as complex as California's, I tell them it's really second-grade arithmetic. It's addition and subtraction. And when we haven't got the political will to do either of those, we borrow. It's clear now our opportunities to borrow are very few, if any. So we're back to addition and subtraction. And with regard to those 2 options, I make reference to the 4th slide in Governor Brown's handout, which has the headline Examples of General Fund Expenditures. And this is where I think the governor is leading with this conversation he believes, and I think we all need to have, with the voters and taxpayers of California. What are our options? They are ever fewer. So what does the state look like with this $25 to $28 billion problem, if we are to do it honestly with just addition or subtraction, or potentially just subtraction? And so that slide lists some of the larger expenditures that we have before us. Medi-Cal at a little over $17 billion. State prisons, $9 billion. UC and CSU at $5.4 billion. Services to the developmentally disabled, $3.1 billion. CalWorks, $3 billion. State mental health hospitals, $1.2 billion. IHSS, $1.7 billion. All of that totals to about $41 billion. So if we were to take all of those major categories and slash them in half, which we know we could never do or would never do, we would really only be about 2/3 to our solution. And that is very dramatic. That is where we are right now. And our years of trying to get around these facts and our successful attempts to sustain this infrastructure of our state, which has made us so great, we have few options this time around. So just the honesty of it all is sobering, of course, but I think it's also somewhat refreshing, given all of the contortions we've been going through over these many, many years to try and sustain. So this is where we are, and I hope that we all together can lay all this out. And again, because the governor said he will not support any revenue that's not supported by the voters, we have to first engage and then better inform voters as to what our collective options are, because they're going to have to be part of the solution. I'm happy to ask my colleagues on the Republican caucus if you'd like to make any introductory comments as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is a new role for me as Vice Chair of this committee. And it's an interesting process to be a part of, because certainly the budget is fundamental to everything else that happens at the state. What we do in the Budget Committee, what we do when we pass a budget, is what enables the policies. It sets the priorities of the state. In a perfect world, we could grow every area we want, but we don't live in a perfect world, and so we have these challenges before us. But today's meeting, this week's meetings, is a lot like an obese, under-exercised patient going to the doctor shopping for yet another opinion, when the first opinion was, you got to lose weight, you got to start exercising, or you're going to have a massive heart attack and die. And that's where the state is. Now, as sad as this difficulty is, as we're framing it, as we're getting another opinion, it's the same opinion, it's just a different date. In fact, the governor's May revision had some very tough medicine for us to take to go on that diet. The Senate Republicans, in the last day of session, voted for those painful cuts. And nobody likes them, trust me. We like to grow government. People are a lot happier when they have expanding programs. They're not happy when there's contracting. But the patient can't support the extra weight. And so, had we enacted the Republican budget back on August 31st, we would not have this $6 billion current year problem. We would have brought the $19 billion remaining problem down to about an $11 billion problem. That's still a big problem, but that's significantly different from what we're looking at today. So, as we're getting this other opinion, I just challenge all of us, as we're working in this bipartisan manner, take the medicine, listen to the plethora of doctors we've had telling us what we have to do. We're here ready to work with you, but understanding that voters have said, we're not sure exactly who's responsible, but we're going to give it all to one party now to solve this problem. And ironically, they hogtied you a little bit in being able to raise revenue. So we are in this together one way or another, even though some areas have been loosened up, some have been tightened up, but we're ready and willing to help solve this problem because our state absolutely has to survive. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Huff. So we're going to start with a fiscal outlook with a presentation by Mac Taylor from the Legislative Analyst's Office. Morning, Mr. Taylor.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Members, you should all have this document in your packets. I'd like to just refer to a couple of the charts in it. Does everybody have that? It's the thicker green document, California's Fiscal Outlook. And if you could go to page 3, the figure 1 at the bottom of page 3. Now, there is a separate document that's being, I think, handed out that is, we'll get to later. This is the thicker document. Does everybody have? Yes, that one, Senator. And I apologize to those of you who I've already gone over this with or you've heard it before, but I think some members have not. So I will be brief, Mr. Chairman.
Go right ahead.
Again, so figure 1 on page 3 shows you your general fund condition as we have projected it for the current year and the coming budget year. And if you look in the middle column, 2010-11, under revenues and transfers, that's what we expect to come in this year. It's about $93 billion. And right below that, expenditures of about $92.5. In other words, we're actually in balance if you look at the numbers. And the reason we end the year in the deficit is because we had a carry-in deficit from the prior year. Now, then if you look at the next year, 11-12, look what happens to both revenues and expenditures. Revenues go down by about $10 billion. Well, we lose all of the temporary tax increases that were enacted 2 years ago. They all elapse by the end of 10-11. That's about $8.3 billion. In addition, we had other one-time things, the sale of state buildings. We had special fund loans that we took. So revenues, in effect, are going down by that, but that's kind of your new base. I mean, that's what you'll have on an ongoing basis. And 10-11 revenues were, in effect, kind of artificially high because of these one-time things. The converse is true in expenditures. They are artificially low because we had so much federal dollars from the stimulus from the era. And we use those federal dollars to offset general fund spending. If you were to look at what we were actually spending, it would be much higher than the 92.5. So you get to 11-12, and now the gap looks rather daunting. That's the $19 billion plus of an operating deficit, an annual shortfall between what you're committing to in your spending and what you have in your revenues. So if you add the carry-in deficit of $6 billion to that operating deficit, that gets you that magic number of $25.4 billion that we published last month, and it's been the basis for the special session. I think the problem that you have this coming budget year is going to be much more difficult to resolve than the budget you just passed a couple of months ago. And let me tell you why. First of all, it is slightly larger. You were dealing with roughly a $20 billion problem last year. But how many of you think we're going to get more federal dollars for the coming fiscal year? We relied very heavily on that last year and on the year before. Tax increases have been an important part of the solution the last couple of years. And as the chair noted, apparently the governor will not accept any unless the voters approve them. Finally, one of the biggest areas where you have counted solutions has been in the area of Proposition 98. And you can count solutions. For example, this past year, we tried to keep Prop 98 spending at roughly the same level as the year before, about $49+ billion. But because the minimum guarantee was considerably above that $49 billion level, you were able to count the solutions from suspending of several billion dollars. And that contributed toward that $20 billion problem that had been identified. For 11-12, our $25.4 billion problem already assumes that Prop 98 will be funded at the minimum guarantee, which is $2 billion below the level of the current year. And that's because of the drop-off in the temporary tax increases. The minimum guarantee goes down. Now, we're not saying you should fund at the minimum guarantee. We're just saying that's kind of the default for purposes of doing our projections. So schools would have a $2 billion hit in the guarantee monies. They would also be losing a lot of their federal money, their temporary federal era money, depending on how they budgeted. And they also would have to backfill for the deferral that we made. Schools could, under the minimum guarantee, what we've budgeted, could take anywhere from a $4 to $5 billion hit from where they were in 2010-11. Now, if you want to have solutions from this largest area of your state budget, you would have to cut below that level that we've assumed. So you don't have some easy stockpile of solutions that you can count from Prop 98, the biggest part of your budget. So you really face an incredibly daunting task for 2011-12. If you turn to page 9, Figure 2 at the top of the page, This just shows our projections for the 4 years beyond the budget year. And the reason we do this is, again, we're not saying we're going to end each year in $20 billion, because you're going to have to take actions as you go along. It just says if you weren't to take no actions to change your revenue system, to reduce your expenditure commitments, you just let it run out, we're looking at deficits, operating deficits each year in the range of $20 billion.
And we could potentially be adding $2.7 billion in fewer federal dollars as well?
Not exactly, for a couple of reasons. The $2.7 billion that I think the governor cited yesterday, and we actually identified in this report last month as a risk, is over 2 years, so it wouldn't add the total amount to the operating deficit. In addition, what the governor didn't mention is that if we do lose those monies, we would also have a reduction in the Prop 98 minimum guarantee, which helps you somewhat to cushion the loss of the monies. However, it makes it worse. Doesn't help schools at all, does it?
Yeah.
So it is a potential additional problem, Mr. Chairman, but not quite to the level that might have been indicated yesterday.
And that cut is ongoing in out years as well?
Yes.
So it's about 2.7 every 2 years?
No, it's about $1.5 billion maybe. But again, after you take account of Prop 98, I don't know what the net effect. It might add $1 billion, for example, to your operating deficit. And we're still looking at what the federal government, obviously it's just a plan right now on the federal estate tax, and we're looking at whether we would get some money, whether we would not get any money. We have a pickup tax that was put into law when we eliminated the inheritance and gift tax back in 1982, and frankly it's just not clear right now both what the federal government is going to do and how that would affect our existing law. With that, Mr. Chairman, I can defer and answer any questions or wait until after finance has spoken.
Given that you brought attention to the figure on page 9, the ongoing $20 billion hole, just to further make reference to your figure on page 11, which shows that once we begin to take action, as you suggested, that this is a larger pill than can be swallowed in 1 year, that your suggestion is that we take successive cuts in the coming years, $10 billion, 5.
Sure, and I'd be happy if people turn to page 11 at the bottom. There's figure 3. And as the chair was mentioning, we haven't taken a lot of permanent reductions. Most of the solutions, by far and away, over 3/4, have been temporary, one-time, short-term. And that's why your problem keeps coming back each year. There's nothing wrong with taking temporary solutions. Let me be very clear about that, especially if they're real temporary solutions. And some temporary solutions are better than others. Some just give you one-time relief. Others give you relief in this year, but you have to pay back in the future, like our local government loan. That makes your problem worse in out years. So even amongst temporary solutions, there are good, better, and worse. We, for example, on the sale of state assets, something that's not been finalized, we don't think that's in the state's best long-term interest financially. But we recognize that we are in such a deep hole now that sometimes you do things that you just have to do to get out of the hole. So clearly, if you were in any sort of better times, that is not something you would want to do. But we recognize that you just don't have great choices. So given that we haven't been able to do a lot of permanent reductions, we've tried to lay out and say, well, look, you need to make, at the very least in this coming year, you need to make a very big down payment on your underlying structural problems. We happen to pick $10 billion, Mr. Chairman. You could pick, if you want to be more aggressive, pick 13, 15. It still means, though, even if you take that amount, much more than we've done in past years, you still have to come up with the shaded area in the first year of temporary solutions. And those aren't going to be easy. It's just that they're easier than committing to people either we're going to raise your taxes permanently or we're going to make reductions in health care or public safety on a permanent basis. They are somewhat easier to do. So we try to give you just one workout plan over the next 4 years. There's nothing magical at all about it. It's just a suggestion that you could see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Senator Evans.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Hello again.
Hi.
One of the things that was raised at yesterday's budget summit but wasn't really fleshed out, but it's something that I'm very interested in getting a better handle on so that all of us in the Assembly and in the Senate really understand our limitations here as we move forward. You threw out the number of $10 billion. Question is obviously, how do we get there? But our hands as a legislature are somewhat tied by several different mandates that are on the state of California. And I want to know, basically, we know how big the problem is, but what we don't know is how limited our ability is to deal with it. So we have voter-approved initiatives that mandate spending. Some of them, like Prop 98, can be suspended by the legislature. Others may or may not be able to. There are certain federal mandates. Some of those we can get exemptions from or waivers from the federal government. Some we can't. Some we might have tried and failed. So that's another area that we need to look at. There are some constitutional mandates. And then there are other things where the courts have said the legislature must provide certain services under certain conditions. So I think we as legislators, and I know me personally, I need to know where I can and cannot go. And the very first question that has to be answered is, what can we not do to meet that $10 billion? And the second question is, what can we do under what circumstances? And then the third question is, where else can we go? So something that's been touched upon but really hasn't been very well fleshed out. And I visually would like to kind of see where we are in all those three categories.
Okay, and I think we can help in that regard. Some will be case by case, and some will be, well, we don't know what, for example, in the case of the courts, what they will restrict us from doing. They've been pretty tough on us. They haven't given us a lot of leeway in some of the program areas. And that's more of the unknown. But we can certainly help you, say, in Medi-Cal, we can't change basic eligibility. You can change other things. And the administration's put things on the table where you have some control. And in some cases, we have supported those recommendations. We know they're very tough reductions, but it's because they're in areas where at least you have some control over. And on Medi-Cal, again, that's our second biggest program. And it's one of our fastest growing programs. And so I'd suggest to you that you can't ignore any of these areas. So I think we can try to help you with some general things, and as we go along, we'd be happy, at your subcommittee hearings as you meet, to help identify those things for you.
Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since we're not going through the specific proposals by the governor yet, we're still talking bigger picture. I figured this would be a better time to ask three questions, not expecting lengthy answers, but I think they're important. Obviously, the federal government has acted in recent days on a couple of issues, from tax breaks, extensions, temporarily at least, along with the extension of unemployment benefits. How does any of that translate back to California directly or indirectly vis-a-vis revenues?
Well, it can only help a little bit when you're pumping additional money into it. Of course, I'm just trying to think. The feds pay all of that, so that doesn't necessarily hurt our deficit in the UI fund. So it's a minor plus to us, obviously. It's more money into the state.
So, but we haven't sort of tried to quantify that.
No, and I think when you do your revenue estimates, where the finance comes out on January 10th, and we'll come out with something afterwards, it will either implicitly or we'll have something we'll plug in to try to recognize that. We'll try to capture it, Senator.
Okay. Second question is, since Election Day, as people have not only tried to ask the question, well, what does the new governor mean for the future of the budget? What is Prop 25, Prop 26, Prop 22, et cetera? It just got me thinking about some of the tough decisions that lay ahead. But if we were able to do a lot of what you've been suggesting be done, not just for the next fiscal year, but for out years, have you done any modeling to estimate how that would translate back to not just a better bond rating, but what opportunities it could provide us then to invest the previously voter-approved bond dollars, whether it's for water, transportation, housing, et cetera, and what better terms on that financing could be?
Well, we haven't, Senator. And maybe the treasurer's a little better at that. Clearly, as far as our bond ranking, you showing good action and making progress and showing that we can address this problem would help. There's no question that that's what they look for, kind of a longer-term ability to address our problems. And I think the treasurer yesterday...
I haven't seen a specific number to it, but I got to believe it's not insignificant.
It's not insignificant. I think the treasurer cited a rather dramatic number of the potential savings over the term of the bonds. and that's not a kind of a discounted value. But no, it's not insubstantial at all.
Along with putting people back to work, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. Now, the counter to that, the other side to that, is what the chair mentioned, the concern about the rising, debt service ratio. In fact, Mr. Chairman, in the back of our book, we have that chart going out a few years. That continues to rise. It will exceed 8% by the end of the period. And this is just one more of the very difficult trade-offs you have. On the one hand, the bond funds, as you just noted, is one good way we have, in fact, one of the only significant ways we have to try to do something to put construction workers back to work, to generate jobs. And on the other hand, it results in added debt service that only makes your job more difficult because each of those dollars has to come out of the budget somewhere else. So it's just another one of those balancing acts you have for you.
And then last question for now. It's been more than just the last 4 years that I've been here, but every year there's that we've had this budget challenge. As part of the overall solution package, there's been, whether it's a fund shift or a borrowing from another account, or let's pay the July payroll in June, and or the June payroll in July, but we'll collect, assume in June the July revenues, all that stuff. Has there been talk about just an itemized list of what all those, for lack of a better term, gimmicks have been, kind of what they add up to, and putting us on a schedule, whether it's over 5 years or 10 years, to begin to undo those? I don't think we'll be able to undo them all in a single year. But again, as a signal that California is going to start making the tough decisions and getting its fiscal house in real order.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. I sometimes raise this after I've talked about what you have to do to get your budget in balance. It almost feels like piling on then to say, you've got these additional problems you're going to have to address after you get your budget back in balance. But I think it's an important reminder. And just as an example, right now we are paying almost 1/6 of our total Prop 98 budget. What we expect them to spend in a given year, we're paying for it in the next fiscal year. That's not appropriate bookkeeping. Mm-hmm. That's not appropriate accounting. And it's exactly your point. And I think the problem is when you're just trying to get your budget in balance, to set that right, you have to take money off the table that just goes back into the next year, and you're getting kind of nothing for it, is the way that many people will view it. But I do think you ought to keep it on your radar as something we need to reverse at some time in the future. And it would also send an important signal to the bond raters and the investment community that, yes, the California's books mean something. So I think it's a really important point.
Okay. Well, let me not just ask the question. Let me make the request. Would you be willing to have your office take a crack at a recommendation on how to do that or achieve that over the next several years?
Well, and even giving you the list was your original question, and I think Ms. Matasantos in her presentation yesterday had several of those on there. We have put them in various places. We're happy to provide that to you. How to do it again, it's a little tough when we're having a problem just getting the budget in balance, but we'd be happy to think about that.
But I don't think we can ignore it for another 20 years.
Right.
Thank you.
Senator Huff, did you have a question? Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Senator Harmon.
Go ahead. Just a couple of quick things. With regards, going back to what you were talking about on some of the reforms and things that we were doing, this is just in general. When we tried to do them, we've gotten challenged by the courts and so forth. Could you also kind of let us know, at some point, if we can't modify it, or we'll get sued because of the changes we're making, but if we just terminate the program, then we don't get sued. Would you kind of, in the future, let us know when that's one of those options? Because at some point, people are going to have to agree to either modify it or we aren't going to be able to provide the program, and that just becomes reality. The other question I have, though, and I'm kind of curious, it's page 24. When I was going down through the differences, the estimates and everything, and I take a look at the difference between budget year 10-11 versus budget year 11-12, you go down here, you see some increases and so forth. I can understand that, but there's a big spike in Medi-Cal.
Yeah, that's the federal monies that goes away.
That's the FMAP.
That's the federal monies that are going away. But then it levels out in the next year. That's what I don't get. It doesn't show us as quite a, it's just a spike. Oh, I see what you're saying. So it's an ongoing expense because we no longer get it.
Yeah, in effect, I think of it as the 10-11 number is artificially low.
Okay.
Because it doesn't reflect the offset of the federal funds.
Is the cost of the federal health care program in there, where's that reflected?
Well, most of those costs won't kick in until later on the end of the forecast. We've tried to take our best shot, but that's a big unknown, obviously. But most additional state costs don't show up till the end of the period.
End of which period?
At the end of the forecast period, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Senator.
So we won't even, okay, so we've got an additional new program cost that'll kick in.
The feds are going to pay most of those additional costs in the near term, and then it's more an out-year problem beyond this forecast period.
And so what kind of money is that going to end up?
Well, I'll defer to my health folks. We can get back to you on that, but it's potentially some big mucks.
All right, thank you.
According to yesterday's presentation, $3.5 billion is
that was a number that, Ms. Montesantos mentioned. I wasn't sure exactly what the source of that was, Senator.
But that would be a debatable number.
Since I don't know what her number represented, I hate to speak to that. Maybe Finance can, where the source of the 3.5.
Yeah. Okay. Senator Harmon.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned in your initial presentation, just for a moment, the pickup tax. That's tied to the federal estate tax.
Exactly.
You know, the federal estate tax has been suspended nationally for all of 2010.
Right.
Congress has now indicated that they are going, it looks like they're going to reinstate it at the 35% level, and California will get part of that. That's what the pickup tax is part of the federal estate tax that people have to pay. Have you taken that into your revenue projections that we will probably be receiving a pickup tax via the federal government?
These projections assume...
And if so, how much is that? I don't have...
Right. The projections assume that old law before the estate tax went away for a while would be resumed, and as you say, that there would be this pickup tax, this credit. And so we had $2.7 billion over the 2 years, 10, 11, 11, 12. Okay. I think it was about 900 and 1.7.
So you are including that?
We included in the projections. The problem, Senator, the kicker on this is that what they've also done is they've changed it from a state credit to a deduction. And our law, when you go back and look at Prop 6, I believe, in 1982...
That's the one that eliminated the inheritance tax.
Exactly.
California state inheritance tax.
And it said... the state shall not levy any sort of inheritance, gift, or estate tax. However, it has the exception for the federal pickup credit.
Right.
And what we're trying to look into, and again, since we don't even know what the federal plan is, it's a little hard, but if it is a deduction, we have to look into, well, will that mean that we can't, in effect, claim anything?
That's a good point.
Now, even if we can claim something, because the rates are lower, the exemptions are so much bigger, so I think they're talking about a $5 billion exemption before you pay estate taxes, and the rate goes down from 45 to 35, we would lose money anyway, some piece of it. So we have lots of threats on that amount, whether it's just we'll lose some of it or potentially, and again, we're still looking into this, we could lose all of it.
Yes. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Anybody else? Thank you, Mr. Taylor. We'll move on to the Department of Finance.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Todd Giroux from the Department of Finance. I'm going to speak specifically to the special session proposal.
Yes.
As it relates to all the other good questions we've heard, we're really in a tough spot because simultaneously to the current governor proposing this special session, we are working with the governor-elect on his budget, and we're not at liberty to discuss what he or may not include in that budget or what he may or may not think about these proposals. And so, as you saw yesterday, most of the slides in the presentation that actually had certain projections actually came from Mr. Taylor's publication. So until we finish our final revenues and expenditures, we don't really have a lot of good information to add to that at this point. But so as far as the proposal itself, in your introduction you alluded to the fact that except for one, these all came from last year's May revision. There's a list of 47 individual proposals. 46 of those were either in the Jan 10 budget or in the May revision, and they did get discussed in last year's special session or in last year's committee process, pre and post May revision, and then many of them were discussed in the conference committee, and ultimately they were not approved in the final budget. Today's value, assuming that there's passage by January 1st, and then in many cases it means time to implement, would be a total 2-year value of $9.9 billion, which would start making some sort of inroads into the total problem that Mr. Taylor's identified of $25 billion. The one proposal that was not in last year's budget is is the weight fee revenue swap, which is in response to the largest item that was approved in last year's special session, which was the gas tax swap, where we went from a sales tax on gas to an excise tax on gas in order to use those excise taxes to pay bond debt and save general fund monies. Because of Prop 22, now it's our view that the excise tax probably can't be used to save those general fund monies, and so we have the governor has a proposal to use the weight fees to pay the bond debt, and now to use the excise taxes to pay for the transportation projects.
So we can at least come out even.
Correct. If you like, I can have Mark Monroe right now speak to more detail on that.
Sure, Mr. Monroe, welcome.
I'm Mark Monroe, Department of Finance. Yeah, well, briefly, of the $1.6 billion that we passed as part of the 2010 Budget Act, we were able to achieve $720 million, but we do think due to Prop 22 we would lose about $850 million. And so, as Mr. Drew noted, you really have the two funding sources coming in to fund the transportation, and so Prop 22. Our proposal is to take more of the excise tax and put that into funding transportation and less of the weight fees.
Very good. A couple of questions come to mind with regard to the governor's overall proposal. First of all, given that I would think the current administration would take some responsibility for where we are relative to where we were in 2003, and that you are on your way out, why would you not propose a total solution? Why stop a third of the way there?
I don't really have an answer for that. I would just go back to the last two special sessions, and in one case, there was a proposal to solve the whole problem, and we, in fact, passed an early February budget. Last year was a partial proposal, and only a partial solution came out of that. But as far as why this is not $25 billion, I don't have an answer for that.
Or even $6 billion for the current.
Yeah. Well, as far as current, it's hard to achieve a large current year savings. But as to why the total exceeds 6, I don't have an answer for that.
And then, would you say that a theme in your proposals have some concern for equity and fairness and spreading the pain and making sure we do this so that everyone's doing their fair share?
Well, I'll address that based on a comment that the Assembly raised, that the majority of the remaining list is in the HHS area. So my response to that would be true here, but that's because it was the main area where reductions were not taken to a large extent. For example, there were large reductions taken to Prop 98. There were some reductions taken to employee compensation, which hits your State Department. And there were reductions taken to corrections, even though a lot of those may not achieve the savings anticipated. But so using the approach we took, which was the remaining May revision, the items that weren't adopted, for the most part, that did leave items in the Health and Human Services area.
Are you suggesting that over recent years we have not taken significant cuts to Health and Human Services?
No, I'm just referencing back to last year's May revision.
So from our figuring, about 70% of your proposed total cuts and solutions are from Health and Human Services, and then another 17% is the elimination of child care, so about 87%. That seems awfully tilted in one direction.
Right, but once again, I'll go back to last year's May revision, which was solving about a $19 billion problem, and with the solutions that came out of that, which, if my math is correct, was from those May proposals was about $13 billion. My list doesn't show a great deal of solutions from the Health and Human Services area. Once again, the approach was to focus on what the May proposal was, take out whatever was adopted or had similar proposals that were adopted, and thus the remainder outside of the weight fees is the proposal in front of you.
Sure. Mr. Taylor, do you have any comments on the weight fees proposal?
Yes, generally speaking, and I have my staff here can speak in more detail. We think it's a good proposal. I think the intent is to try to give you the savings that you assumed from the swap, and to not really change what's happening in the transportation area. We do point out that this is a short-term proposal and that you're going to have to do a more comprehensive, I think, proposal for the longer term. But as a short-term kind of proposal, we think it makes sense.
Anything to add? Just there for questions. Mr. Taylor, a couple other concerns with regard to some of these proposed cuts, shifting county mental health realignment funding to social service programs. Are there any legal questions involved here?
Yes, absolutely, and I think those were discussed, whether you can do this because of various MOEs and things. So that's one that's problematic.
And I know this is all of this we had gone over last year, in some cases multiple years. The automated speed enforcement, which didn't have much support from either side of the aisle, this year there's some adjustments made to it, so I think there's incentives for local government to benefit from it.
I'm not sure. We had thought that it was worth considering, just given your situation.
Right.
But we'd have to take a look if there's been some changes. Maybe finance can comment on that.
Actually, those local revenues were included in last year's proposal.
That was the same. So I think I saw some with modifications.
Well, the reason the dollar change would have been based on implementation time, so it achieves full value in the 11-12 fiscal year. Whereas last year we were working from a July 1 implementation date to get partial year revenue.
And Mr. Taylor, your support for this is purely fiscal. It's not based on public safety.
Well, we felt that there was some information that indicated it did improve safety, so it was kind of both. But we recognize there's a big downside that people see to having the greater kind of big brother issue, I guess. So it's not. We realize it's not an easy call, but for both those reasons, yes, we felt it was something. Given your alternatives that you were looking at, it was a reasonable thing to consider.
Right. Very good. I know we have questions from the committee. I believe we have some stakeholders in the room with regard to the late fees, and I thought if we had questions on late fees specifically, that we might bring up the stakeholders so we can get their take on this. Any other questions for Mr. Giroux or Mr. Taylor? Yes, Mr. Huff.
Question for finance. I kind of made some broad brush stroke comments in the beginning. I was just wondering if you have any data that could back up. Had we actually adopted the May revision during the budget year, what would we be looking like now with the magnitude of our problem?
If I do some quick math, and I probably should leave out, trying to think back to what the May revision Prop 98 was versus the final, it was probably somewhere close in dollars, just different shift in years. But kind of looking at the bottom line, you would, if today's proposal was adopted, you would get the $9.9 billion, and I believe the value above what you could get in the current year would be about $6.3 billion additional to that. And so that sounds like, compared to the $25 billion, you'd be roughly 15 and change better if the May revision had been.
So no current year issue.
Right, so no current year issue and a smaller structural deficit.
So
yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Drew, just to add to that, we know that there are always unintended consequences. I think we had some testimony last year when we were considering some of these cuts that if we had taken them and found ourselves where Mr. Huff is suggesting we could potentially have been if we had followed that suggestion, unemployment would probably be up another 1.5%, and we would have any number of other problems before us, just different problems. Because as I think it was Mr. Taylor and probably Governor Brown both said yesterday, we're going to pay a price no matter what we do. If we increase our revenues, it will impact the economy. If we make these dramatic cuts, it's going to impact the economy. They all have their consequences.
I think it's clear that inaction, though, has resulted in us continuing to trip over the same lump of deficit year after year.
All right, we have our stakeholders here. Senator Lowenthal.
No, I'm going to wait until you ask the stakeholders, and then we should respond.
Very good. Well, we'll ask our stakeholders.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Deanne Baker, representing the California State Association of Counties. I just want to make sure everyone's clear that CSAC was one of the proponents or supporters of the transportation tax swap back in March when you then adopted it, including the general fund relief that you're focused on here with respect to the late fee proposal. But it's our perspective, and we've been working with a number of the other transportation stakeholders that you'll hear from, that it's absolutely imperative that the entire swap be validated, that you not just look at the general fund relief component. The entire $2.5 billion a year that is included in the transportation tax swap, in our opinion, from our council review, it's self-executing. In November of 2011, that will no longer be in place. So it's our perspective that you need to take action to validate the taxes that are replacement taxes, as mentioned before, for the sales tax that was eliminated. I think you heard yesterday, it's been mentioned again throughout this hearing, that any direction you turn will hurt the economy. But in this instance, that's not the case. If you validate this tax swap, you will save jobs, you will stimulate the economy, you will provide general fund relief that's important for credit rating purposes and other savings, as you've also talked about. So from our perspective, we can accept the proposal to use the late fees for general fund relief, but it has to be coupled and linked to the validation of the entire tax swap.
Thank you, Ms. Baker.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members, Joshua Shaw with Shaw Yoder Antwi, representing the California Transit Association and all the local public transit systems that provide the bus and rail service to your constituents. While we've only had a little less than 24 hours to review the actual draft language that I understand was submitted to Ledge Council that would enact the governor's solution in this regard, and therefore I don't have an official position, it seems to me that the proposal is consistent with the goals of the proponents of Proposition 22 and other transportation folks around the table, in that it does achieve appropriate general fund savings out of appropriate transportation revenues. And that's kind of when you read the proposition, you see that the folks just wanted to ensure that transportation revenues and other local government revenues would be spent on those transportation programs like public transit that those revenues have historically been intended for. And to the extent this proposal pays for transportation bond debt service, that's a consistent thing. And the flip side is, of course, to the extent that provides savings for the general fund, that's a good thing, because I believe the proponents of that measure also recognize, the horrendous choices that you all are facing with the current governor and the governor-elect in terms of making program cuts and or revenue increases as necessary to fund your general fund. So in that sense, I assume my group will be very supportive of this proposal, but want to associate myself with Ms. Baker's remarks and indicate that we think for a variety of transportation planning and programming purposes and just basic economic strength and recovery purposes, you also need to simultaneously validate the swap of earlier in March so that those underlying revenues are there to support not only this general fund solution, but those transportation activities that are so vital to continuing the recovery that California hopefully is on and strengthening that recovery. For instance, the investment in transportation programs that means jobs for contractors, that gets investment in transit systems that gets people from point A to point B. And then specifically within our world, that also includes what a couple of the senators asked about, the bond debt service on transportation bonds. You interacted with the LAO on that question. And in our world, transit, I can think of many projects that are literally waiting right now for the CTC to vote to approve some things, but they can't to get projects going because of the question of how we're going to pay bond debt service. So again, if this helps that, I think my group will ultimately be supportive. And then finally, from a transit perspective, there may frankly be some additional savings that are achievable under Prop 22 that we want to talk to all of you and the governor-elect about to ensure that you get as much as you can as necessary that is legally defensible under the status of the Constitution as it is today. And we're ready, willing, and able to work with you on that. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. With a Bay Area region hat on, I can tell you we are suffering greatly currently with regard to the disinvestment in transit over recent years. I would imagine, I want to ask, you think that we can accomplish all of this and keep or reestablish the transit allocation for operators at close to the 75%?
That's one of the issues that is certainly posed by the Constitution, and we think we've got some ideas to do something just like that, that you could do statutorily. I think it makes more policy sense to do it in the context of a larger solution. The LAO talks about a larger solution. We think that needs to be done sooner rather than later to ensure, for all the other reasons I said, including making sure that the local grants can go to local transit operators as they're planned in the March legislation. So the quicker answer is yes. We think you can do that statutorily. I don't know if it ends up being exactly 75-25 split. 75% was intended to go, of transit funds were intended to go to local transit operators in the swap. It depends on the amount of dollars available under the one remaining transit source that's left, the sales tax on diesel. But we have some ideas and want to talk to you and your staff about that, Senator.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members, Mark Watts on behalf of Transportation California Contractors and Allied Labor Coalition. I think Deanne and Josh have explained our stakeholders' position pretty well, and I won't go into any more detail. I do want to just pivot on the line of inquiry by Senator Padilla. I think our organization is very interested in the jobs component that would be restored by virtue of this passing and the ability to go forward with general obligation bonds in the future. We're concerned in the absence of this weight fee swap, where would we get the resources from the general fund to actually support the bond programs going forward? So we are very encouraged by this proposal and support it. We also support rapid adoption of Prop 26 Solution 2. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Leno, members of the committee. Joe Cruz on behalf of the California Alliance for Jobs, the men and women who actually perform the work on these large-scale construction projects. We were actually instrumental part of helping craft the early excise gas tax swap last year. And at the core of that package was obviously the shift of debt service to the state highway account. But the other key component was the 17.3 cents of excise gas tax that will keep most of my guys working on these jobs in the future. My industry now is hemorrhaging with 35% unemployment. It's huge that we solve this problem now and not wait until tomorrow. We will maintain our support of the general fund relief with the weight fees, but it will be conditioned on getting the excise gas tax swap ratified with 2/3. We appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and we look forward to working with you guys as we move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. Jennifer Whiting with the League of California Cities. I find myself in a different position today because we actually opposed the gas tax swap last year. Part of that was because we were not at the table during the discussions. However, now the problem is much bigger. We are very interested in pursuing a comprehensive solution that makes everybody whole, the state, the locals, transit. We have been meeting with the transportation stakeholders. We are all on the same page, and we do want to work with you moving forward. Again, just want to stress the solution has to be comprehensive. It can't be just one piece at a time. We need to address the 26 issue also.
Thank you, Ms. Whiting. Senator Lowenthal?
Yeah, I would like some clarification, actual numbers, and from Mac and others. You know, we were not really supporters of Prop 22. We were worried about what was going to happen with Prop 22, especially, and Prop 26 with the gas swap, and so to the gas swap. So what I need to know exactly is what I'm hearing, and obviously this is all new, and we have to really kind of flesh this out. And I need one. What we're proposing right now is, I think, and I need a temporary fix. We are not going to be able to have a comprehensive solution in terms of all the funding that was going on when we did the gas swap. So I need to understand, how will this weight fee now, how will that impact what we have proposed already for local streets, local roads? Will we have less money now with this weight fee? Will we have more money? What exactly is going to happen? Does it comply with all the constitutional issues that were in 22 and 26? And exactly in terms of when we're talking about a more comprehensive approach, once after November of 2011, once where Prop 26 comes into play, what will it take? Can that be done statutorily? Does it take a 2/3 vote to do this statutorily? Where are we constrained? I mean, everybody's talking about a comprehensive, but have we also constrained us now? So I need some kind of answers, both specifically and what are we talking about in terms of a real fix?
Jessica DiGiambattista with the Analyst's Office. Senator, to your first question on transportation funding by different program areas, under the governor's proposed weight fee swap, essentially the funding by transportation program areas would be the same as it would have been under the enacted budget. The thing that's changing and that's unclear is the impacts of Proposition 22 and 26. So the governor's proposal doesn't make changes in terms of how it's implementing those propositions. You may see some changes in terms of how much funding is going to different program areas just based on decisions, for example, by the state controller or other administrative entities in terms of how they're choosing to implement the provisions of Proposition 22.
Specifically, what are you talking about that we need to understand about how 22 will operate in 26?
In terms of your transportation programs, our understanding is that the state controller is assuming that the formulas that distribute the new excise tax that was raised under the tax swap, that those are repealed under Proposition 22, and that the only statute left on the books to govern the distribution of the excise tax says that 6 cents goes to local agencies and the balance of the funding comes to the state. And so local agencies would receive less funding under that. That's, again, not part of the governor's proposal, but it's part of the state controller's interpretation of Proposition 22. In terms of looking at a comprehensive solution, we think that you can take a two-step approach. If you want to take some more immediate actions to deal with your budget problem, you can adopt the weight fee proposal. It is essentially a short-term proposal. It would not continue on. You wouldn't be able to continue this on after November of 2011 in the absence of taking a more comprehensive approach. But you could score some savings now, and then we would recommend that you do need to look at a comprehensive approach. We would caution you that transportation funding, as you know, Senator, is extremely complex, and the effects of Proposition 22 and the interaction between 22 and 26 are still very much unknown. And so we would caution you that you need to take a thorough approach and not just rush into trying to do a comprehensive solution without taking the time to figure out how all the different moving pieces are going to factor into that solution.
The weight fee, will that take a two-thirds vote?
The weight fee piece, I think, could be done on a majority vote.
Although I assume it's an urgency vote, which would be two-thirds anyway.
Well, but I mean, if you were to take an action in the special session, as long as that action went into effect in the current year, you would be able to score all of the savings from it. So there's not, even on the weight fee side, while you can do it if you want to take immediate action, we don't think that there's a need to necessarily rush and do that piece of it either. In terms of reenacting the tax swap or something similar, that would take a two-thirds vote.
Thank you.
Mr. Huff.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the stakeholders seem to be singing from the same page. You want a comprehensive fix. And Mr. Shaw explained that a little bit, but I'd like CSAC to articulate the why. We're looking at $850 million, and you're looking for comprehensive. There are a lot of moving parts, as we heard, and so I'm not sure we can do that now.
Sure.
But is that for certainty in the bond market, or what is
Sure.
the need to do it all right now?
Sure, and there's no doubt that the collision of 22, 26, and the swap has baffled a lot of attorneys. We're trying to get literally 100-plus attorneys to agree, which is not easy. But we have been spending many hours as a stakeholder group trying to come to the conclusion of how to make this fix. And one of the reasons for the immediacy is that we're under the assumption that the state controller is going to stop paying any money from the new replacement tax, the 17.3 cents. We don't expect any payment in this month or going forward. We understand all of the money, which is $2.5 billion, will go into the state highway account, and there's no appropriation authority. And nor is there any allocation authority, according to the opinion of the State Controller's Office. As we understand it, we have not had a face-to-face. We're trying to set that meeting up with League and CSAC attorneys and the State Controller's Office. So that immediately will stop the flow of this $2.5 billion in transportation revenue and shut down projects. In addition to that, in early spring, the California Transportation Commission has to come up with their fund estimate to redo the State Transportation Improvement Program. And if they can't count on this revenue, you are going to see many, many projects around the state literally come to a halt. So there are significant consequences way before November of 2011 from our perspective. And we think we're close to a comprehensive solution if you combine it with this weight fee proposal.
So just to clarify then, even though the Prop 26 said November 11, your plethora of attorneys believe that there's complications prior to that, or the impacts are felt before that time?
Not our attorneys. Unfortunately, the State Controller's Office attorneys.
All right.
Senator Huff, if I could just add, in terms of the immediacy of paying the local agencies from transportation funds, due to sort of changing interpretation on the part of the State Controller's Office, the local agencies did receive a double payment for November. So while they would not receive a substantial payment in December, they've already sort of been prepaid for that. So we think you could potentially wait until January to take the time to come up with a thorough kind of package that we really think is necessary in order to make sure that the swap is done correctly and that it accounts for all of the different moving pieces that are still at this point unknown.
Have you had discussions with or knowledge of why the controller is kind of changing the interpretation?
Our understanding is that initially the November payment was sent out at the higher level because of a misinterpretation on their part of how the existing the base 18-cent excise tax is distributed, that they interpreted it to be a 1/3, 2/3, whereas it's really 6 cents, and then everything above 6 cents. And so so they initially gave the local agencies 1/3 of the new excise tax that was generated from the swap, and then when they went back and took a look at the statute, it's not a percentage proportional share, it's based on cents, and so the local agencies get 6 cents, and then the balance goes to the state.
Does that mean they were overpaid already? I saw some shaking heads over here, so I don't know how to interpret everything.
Our understanding from the discussions with the State Controller's Office is that they did receive a double payment in November because they did receive that 1/3 of the 17.3 cent, the new excise tax, whereas the Controller's interpretation is that they should not have received any of that. And so that essentially they got 1/3 of the 18 cents and then 1/3 of almost 18 cents. And so they did receive a higher amount in November.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Lowenthal.
Yeah, I just have one question for the proponents of 22. Were you not aware that this could happen?
Ms. Whiting.
When we asked that question and you said it wouldn't, I remember some of those discussions that you would not have these constraints. And now we're hearing we have to do this swap now, we have to change it to do the way, and I agree, what is it is, and let's move forward. But I'm just wondering, were you not aware that we would get into this mess?
On our part, on the league's part, our attorneys did not anticipate the read of Prop 22 that the Controller's Office has made. And as Deanne mentioned, we're trying to get a meeting with the Controller's Office because, frankly, right now we don't really know what they're doing or why they came to that conclusion. So I guess right now I would say no, we didn't anticipate that.
And Senator Lowenthal, if you're speaking about the California Transit Association, the dynamic that I believe the LAO and Ms. Baker and Ms. Wyden just spoke about is, it turns out, about local streets and roads funding, so there's not a problem in the current year for transit, although as a proponent, I don't understand the logic that the controller's resting on apparently and would have said
you did
no,
not
we would not have
anticipate that there
problem.
possibly could be an interpretation by the controller.
That's correct. In other words, if that were ever applied to the transit funding piece that I'm more familiar with, because I've read 22 once or twice, I would probably be disagreeing with the controller if they tried to do the same thing they're doing to cities and counties.
And Senator, my organization was not party to Proposition 22. Just want to remind you, however, that the driver in this issue is Prop 26. The risk to transportation programs is Prop 26. Not so much 22.
Well, 22 contributes now.
It contributes, but the real drop dead for $2.5 billion is do nothing by next November.
Right. That's 26 that we have to. But we also have to deal with the controller's interpretation of 22 also. And so.
And Senator Lowenthal, CSAC, of course, was not a supporter of Prop 22, but we're trying to determine as to whether or not our folks thought they were overpaid in the month of November. We could not ascertain that based on the fluctuations that we've seen in our monthly gas tax payments as a result of deferrals, et cetera, economy. All I can tell you is this whole lack of certainty is another reason we need to act sooner than later. It is now that we're gearing up for the construction season, and if we don't know what kind of revenue streams we can expect, we're not going to be contracting out projects. And again, it's all about the economy and jobs. This should happen first. This is an easy piece that should not affect anyone negatively.
The problem, I just want to say that beyond this course, on the 30,000 foot, it goes back to the question about mandates and so forth. The more we legislate by initiative, the more we tie ourselves down by initiative, we're going to find all of our flexibility constrained tremendously. So, this is just another example of the initiative process gone awry.
And Joe Cruz on behalf of the California Alliance for Jobs, an early proponent of Prop 22. I echo Mark's sentiments that Prop 26 at this point is giving my organization a lot more heartburn, but we sympathize with the League and CSAC on different interpretations of 22 at this point. And there's so many out there that we're all kind of getting our feet underneath us at this point.
Only underscores Mr. Lowenthal's point. Ms. Fuller.
I'd like to check my understanding with Mr. Giroux. So let me ask this and tell me if I've gotten this straight. So we went into this recession with not enough reserves, back according to the governor's slideshow yesterday. And then the legislature did not enact enough reductions or increase in revenues during the period of the recession as it began to deepen. And so now we are at an extreme cash flow crisis that we are running around arguing about what's legal and not legal to be able to sue to fix the cash flow crisis because of liquidity. Is that kind of the overall sort of scenario? And I'm putting it right back on the legislature because I understand that you've made some great proposals.
I guess in regards to the larger general fund problem, we've been struggling balancing budgets going back to about 99-2000. We were getting close to some structural balance, maybe in the 5-6 fiscal year, if I'm getting that right. We were getting close to a structural balance. We never really did have sufficient reserves, and then obviously the recession hit. We redid the 8-9 budget, it seems about 8 or 10 times before that one finally passed. And right about when that one passed, that's when the recession hit full tilt. The special session was called. We actually presented the budget early that year on New Year's Eve. The Prop 58 session was called. We had the early February budget. At that time, if memory serves, we solved to maybe the low 30s, if 40, close to 40. Part of that was predicated upon a special election in May. As it turns out, revenues plummeted beyond that point. None of the proposals, as I recall, in the special session passed, which cost us about $5 billion more. And so we again, the next July, tried to solve to, I think, $34 billion more. 20 more. So I'm off by 10 each way. And we really haven't caught up since. As far as on the cash side, we have become very adept at using internal borrowables, using outside sources to try to manage on a cash flow. But through those times, it was really cash as much as budget that was forcing the need to need immediate action because we have to pay our bills. But so that's kind of the quick history. And so we were getting close to solving, if you go beyond when we actually sold the bonds to borrow the prior reserves, develop a plan to work it out. We came to close to structural balance in 5-6, and then we hit the floor. 25 to 30% drop in annual revenues, and we really haven't caught up since.
And so our comments from our committee is that the reason that we did not have enough people join the Republicans in the budget vote in August was because there were unanticipated consequences that might have to be mitigated, and those unanticipated consequences, maybe I'm wondering, did we not fully weigh that maybe the unintended consequence of not having past that $8 billion in current year solutions was far worse than the potential, because one, we now continue in a structural imbalance, and two, those were potential consequences that perhaps could have been mitigated by a jobs pact, revenue increase bills, a policy bill. So because we continue to delay in the structural, ongoing balancing of the budget, the real question before us really seems to be, when are we going to be ready, the legislature, I'm not asking you, it's a rhetorical question, but when are we going to be ready to quit worrying about unanticipated consequences that are potential, that might have to be mitigated, and actually do some actual budget structural realignment? And it sounds like we need some tax reform as well as a jobs pact. And so I'm getting a little frustrated about how, we worry about all the things that might or might not come true and just move on. And thank you for your presentation today. And I'm glad that I'm really encouraged by the governor-elect trying to get the question out for us so that we can discuss it and frame the question in a way that allows us to move on to budget actuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller. And since we're recounting recent history, Mr. Giroux, I don't think we should overlook the fact that an act by the administration without any participation by the legislature created the largest new spending program the state has seen in the past 10 years, a $6 billion new line item, and that was when the governor rescinded the restoration of the vehicle license fee. So it's a big part of the equation, should not be quickly overlooked in a review of history. Any other questions before we conclude our work for the day? Yes, Mr. Harmon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A couple of weeks ago, when I was reading a local newspaper, I ran across an article by Robert J. Samuelson, who is a reporter, news writer for Newsweek and Washington Post columnist. He was commenting on the recommendations made by the Federal Deficit Reduction Committee. That was two people, Mr. Simpson and I forget the other one. He said some things that I think are pretty relevant to California, and if you'd bear with me just for a moment, I'd like to read a couple things that he said. It says, Washington, people who wonder what America's budget problem is ultimately about should look to Europe. In the streets of Dublin, Athens, and London, angry citizens are protesting government plans to cut programs and raise taxes. Sound familiar? Cut programs and raise taxes. The social contract is being broken. People are furious. They feel betrayed. This is the part that got me. Modern democracies have created a new morality. Government benefits, once confirmed, cannot be revoked. People expect them and consider them property rights. Just as government cannot randomly confiscate property, it cannot withdraw benefits without violating that moral code. The old-fashioned idea that government policy should serve the national interest has given way to inertia and squatters' rights. And that kind of struck home with me. I think it's going to take some real political courage by the legislature and the individual members of the legislature when we look at these benefits and the cuts that will have to be made in them. None of us want to make these cuts, but we should remember that they are not absolute, vested, inherent property rights. It's really something that government probably got carried away in granting some of these benefits. He goes on to say, for years, it was assumed that a rapidly growing economy could pay for added programs. The result was the careless use of government for almost anything that made a good slogan or could support a lobby. The underlying economic assumptions were over-optimistic. Well, that's exactly what we did last year when we assumed we were going to get $3.5 billion from the federal government. We assumed that the economy would grow at 8% or some other absurdly high number. So we just need to be more practical, and we need to realize that some of these programs are going to have to be cut. It will be painful, and it will take political courage. So that's my little comment. If you want to take a look at this, I think it was around December 5th. You can probably find it on the Internet. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harmon. Ms. Evans.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe it's the Simpson-Bowles Commission that you're referring to, Mr. Harmon. the Federal Commission? Yeah. And I might just add to that we might want to take a look at Reykjavik, Iceland, rather than Dublin, Ireland, and take a look at what they're doing there, how their people are responding. But what I really wanted to do was just observe for the umpteenth millionth time that the cuts that are being proposed by Governor Schwarzenegger in this proposal, as in his May revision, as in the budget proposals that we've dealt with in the last few years, almost all of them fall on the backs of the women and the children of the 8th largest economy in the world. And that, to me, is not morally justifiable. I appreciate all the comments that have been made here. I think we're going to have our work cut out for us under very different circumstances than we have in the last few years. Some of those are positive, some of those are negative. But I've long thought that we are going to get to the point where we run out of options, and that's why I asked that question that I did. What options truly are on the table here that can be legally justified and defended? And in my opinion, I will also add morally justified and defended. Because in the end, the budget that's adopted for any state or nation or household or city or county is one that reflects its people's priorities. And this is the people's budget, and I think we have to keep that in mind as we move forward. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be pretty. It hasn't been as long as I've been in government. It is a challenge, though, and I think it's one that we are up to doing if we're willing to make some very difficult decisions, and that's on both sides of the aisle. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Evans. A good segue to a last question I wanted to put forward, not to invest too much more time in it. I know we need to get moving. But we've just received this 1115 Medicaid waiver from the federal government. I know it's very complex. We won't go into all of it, many parts, but I just wanted to get a sense from Mr. Giroux or from Mr. Taylor. Some of the proposals before us in the special session, the cap and the mandatory co-pays, would we need a waiver from our waiver to be able to do that? I don't believe that's part of the waiver.
I'll let the experts take a shot at that, Mr. Chair.
The Department of Finance, that's always been a part of these proposals, is we would need a waiver for co-payments and state plan amendments for the various caps, service caps.
Any reason why we didn't put that into the original waiver?
Well, we didn't have state law authorizing us to institute those co-payments, so we really viewed those as separate tracks. The state has a number of different waivers that serve different purposes.
All right, so this would be under our gray area of either legal or in need of further federal allowance.
This would require a federal waiver, yes.
Yeah.
Or state plan amendment, depending on the specific proposal.
Okay. Anything else from LEO on this? Any other questions, committee members? All right. Well, we're off on our first step, and I thank everyone for joining us today. We stand adjourned.
Oh,
I'm sorry. Do we have public comment? Do we not want to cut public comment short?
Mr. Chair.
Yes. Mr. Emerson, Dr. Emerson.
Yeah. Before we adjourn, what's our plan? Are we setting up additional meetings?
There was consideration by the pro tem of a budget committee hearing on Monday to potentially take the weight fee proposal to the floor, but clearly there's more work to be done on it. We know we need to move quickly, but there's more deliberation that needs to occur, so it's not going to happen before the first of the year. So this committee will be convening when we get back in January.
Thank you.
Tuesday the 3rd?
Tuesday, there's no corrections.
Corrections does, but Senator DeSaulnier will be chairing a committee hearing, an informational hearing next Tuesday, but otherwise this committee, short of that informational hearing, will not be meeting before January 1st. It is, it's a budget committee hearing officially, and it will be chaired by Senator DeSaulnier. All right, and is there any public comment? If not, we stand adjourned. Thank you.